All right, so when's your quiz? Tomorrow. And it's on 3.1 and 3.2. So we're going to start with number 3. So looking at number 3. How do we find the zeros of the function? So find the zeros and solve mean the same thing. So we're solving for x. We talked about this yesterday. If I have x squared plus x plus a number, or something like that, where I have an x squared and an x, what do I have to do to solve? I have to factor. If I just have an x squared or like a parentheses squared, what do I have to do? What would I have to do? Square root. All right, so for A, am I going to factor or square root it? Factor, because I have an x squared and an x. So to factor this, we just factor it normally. What are 2 factors of 2 that add to 3? 2 and 1. So I would put x plus 2 and x plus 1. And I factored it, but I still have to solve. So what can I do to solve? Set each one equal to 0. So x plus 2 equals 0 and x plus 1 equals 0. So x is equal to negative 2 and x is equal to negative 1 because we would just subtract 2 on both sides and subtract 1 on both sides. So these are our 2 answers. For B, before we can factor, we have to have it be equal to 0 to start. So I have to move all of my terms to one side. So this is always step 1. Have it be equal to 0. First thing we do. So how can I move all my terms to one side? I'm going to subtract 12. Move that over to the left side so it'll cancel out. And I can also add 48. So just be careful that you're only combining like terms with each other. So that 2x squared stays the same. I can combine the x's together. So negative 16x minus 12x would be negative 28x. And then plus 48 is equal to, now on the right, I have nothing left, so it'd be equal to 0. All right, now how can I factor this? Divide it all by 2. So I can divide everything here by 2. If you're going to divide by a number, you have to divide everything by that number. So just make sure everything in your equation is divisible by that number. So this would be x squared minus 14x plus 24 is equal to, what's 0 divided by 2? 0. So it's like taking out the GCF, but we can just get rid of it because I can divide 0 by 2 and it's still 0. Now we can factor this normally. Now that my leading coefficient's 1, I can just say, what are the 2 factors of 24 that add to negative 14? Negative 12 and negative 2. Perfect. So x minus 12 and x minus 2 equals 0. Now I factored, but I still need to solve. How can I solve? Set each little equation equal to 0. So x minus 12 is equal to 0. X minus 2 is equal to 0. So to solve each equation, I would add 12 to both sides in my first equation. So x is equal to positive 12. And in my second equation, I would add 2 to both sides. So x is equal to positive 2. Yes?
You don't gotta put the 2 in front of it.
No, because I took it out. And I divided it to get rid of it. Yes. All right, let's look at C. So what do I need to do first for C? So am I going to solve or factor? Factor. So what do I need to factor? What do I need to have if I want to factor? It has to be equal to 0. So how can I make this equal to 0? I can subtract the 6x to move it to the left, and I can add 3 to move that to the left too. So these will cancel out on the right. So now I have 3x squared minus 6x plus 3. None of these are like terms, so I can't combine them. So I just make sure I keep it in standard form. That way I can factor. So we want this to be in standard form. That way it'll make it easier for us to factor.
Can you, instead of doing that, just move the 3x squared?
You can, but when we factor, we like it when our x squared term, the number in front, is positive. But you could move it to the right and then take out a negative 3. So that it's the same thing. All right, what can I do next? Divide everything by 3. So you can take out my GCF. It just gets, we get rid of it because we're dividing 0 by 3 also. So this would be x squared minus 2x plus 1 is equal to 0. Now we can factor this normally. Do I have 2 factors of 1 that add to negative 2? Negative 1 and negative 1. So I have x minus 1 and x minus 1 equals 0. So now I factored. How can I solve? Set both of them equal to 0. So x minus 1 is equal to 0 and x minus 1 is equal to 0. And then we just solve each equation for x separately. So plus 1 to both sides gives us x is equal to 1. Plus 1 on both sides here. So again, x is equal to 1. Yeah, since these are the same number, you only really have to list it once. That's fine. 4a. So again, here we are solving. When I have a parentheses squared, am I going to solve by factoring or solve with the square roots? Square root. So in order to solve with the square roots, I need the parentheses squared alone first. It has to be all by itself before we can square root. So what do I need to do to get that parentheses all by itself? Divide by negative. I need that negative to go to the other side, so I'm going to divide both sides by negative 1. So now I have x plus 9 squared alone, and that's equal to negative 64. Bless you. Now once my parentheses is alone, what can I do? Square root it. What do I have to include when I take the square root of both sides? Plus or minus. Don't forget that plus or minus. So the square root and the squared cancel, so I'm just left with everything that's inside the parentheses, so x plus 9 on the left. And on the right, what's the square root of negative 64? I can take out the negative and make it an I. And the square root of 64 is 8, so this would be 8i. So plus or minus 8i. Don't forget that plus or minus since we took the square root of both sides. And then what's the last step? Subtract 9. Can I combine negative 9 with 8i? No, because they're not like terms. So I have x is equal to negative 9 plus or minus 8i. So for B, do I have to solve by factoring or square roots? Factoring, because I have an x squared and an x. But to factor, we need it to be equal to 0. So how can I make this equal to 0? Subtract 36. What's the 36 going to combine with on the left? The 4, because those are the like terms. So it'll cancel out on the right. On the left, I have x squared plus 4x minus 32 is equal to 0. So now I can factor this. What are 2 factors of negative 32 that add to 4? 8 and negative 4, perfect. So in my parentheses, I have x plus 8 and x minus 4. What should I do next? Set them both equal to 0. So x plus 8 is equal to 0. X minus 4 is equal to 0. And then I just solve these 2 equations separately. So subtract 8 on both sides for the first one. X equal to negative 8. The second one, I add 4 to both sides. So x is equal to 4. All right, let's look at C. Am I going to solve by factoring or square roots here? Square roots. Since I have the parentheses squared, that tells me I have to solve using square roots. So I need that part all by itself. The parentheses squared has to be alone before I divide by 4. Because if I divide by 4, I have to divide everything by 4, which isn't the best thing to do since we can't divide 15 by 4. I want to add 15 to the right side first. That way it'll make it a little bit easier to divide next. So 4x minus 4 squared is equal to 2. Now what can I do? Before that, divide by 4. So x minus 4 squared is equal to, can I simplify 2 over 4? 1/2, perfect. And then what can I do next? Square root both sides. What do I have to remember to include when I take the square root of both sides? Plus or minus. This would be plus or minus square root 1/2. And then on the left, the square root and the squared cancel, so it's just x minus 4. And then what's the last step? Add 4. Can I combine 4 and square root 1/2? No, so I just leave the 4 in front. So it'll be 4 plus or minus square root 1/2. So you can only combine them if they're like terms. If not, just leave them separate. Yes? We can simplify the square root of 1/2, which would be, because it's the square root of 1 over the square root of 2, which would be 1 over 2. 1 over the square root of 2. So you could simplify this to be 4 plus or minus 1 over square root 2. All right, let's take a look at D. Am I going to solve by factoring or square roots here? Square roots. But what do I need to do first before I can take the square root? I have to move the 10 to the other side. So I need that parentheses squared alone. It has to be all by itself before we can take the square root. So I'm going to subtract 10 on both sides. So 4 times x minus 2 squared is equal to negative 8. What can I do next? Divide by 4. So x minus 2 squared is equal to, what's negative 8 divided by 4? Negative 2. Now that my parentheses are all by itself, what can I do? Square root both sides. And what do I have to remember when I take the square root of both sides? Plus or minus. Can I simplify the square root of negative 2? I can take out the I, so that negative is going to come out and turn into an I. So it's I square root 2. And on the left, the squared and the square root cancel, so it's just x minus 2. And then what's the last step? Add 2 to both sides. Can I combine 2 and I square root 2? No, so it's just 2 plus or minus I square root 2. If you can combine it, we would have to split it up. Because you would have, let's say if we had, I don't know if any of these examples work out to that. But if we had it, it's equal to like plus or minus 5. Let's say x plus 2 is equal to plus or minus 5. I can subtract 2 on both sides, but 2 combines with 5. So before I do that, I want to split it up. So we did a couple examples like these in the notes. So it'd be x plus 2 is equal to positive 5, and x plus 2 is equal to negative 5. We're going to get 2 x's again. It could be. Yeah. So then here we would subtract 2. So x is equal to 3, and x is equal to negative 7. So if you could combine them, just split it up so you can easily see that we have a positive 5 and a negative 5 is what we're combining it with. So for example, again, just so we can see, if I had something like x plus 2 is equal to plus or minus 3 square root 2, can I combine negative 2 with 3 square root 2? No. So I would just leave it separate. So x is equal to negative 2 plus or minus 3 square root 2. Because 3 square root 2 is all one term. So these, again, are not like terms, so we couldn't combine them. Good questions. All right, let's look at E. All right, so for E, I have a p squared and a p. So do I have to factor or square root? Factor. I have to factor. So how do I factor this? So you're right, we have to factor. But how do I factor? So I can take out my GCF, which is p. So I take out the p and I'm left with p minus 4. But I don't want to divide both sides by p because that would get rid of my answer. We can only divide if it's a number, but because it's a variable, we don't want to get rid of it. What can I do next to solve? Just like I did before. What do I do next? After you factor, you set both of them equal to 0. So p is equal to 0, and p minus 4 is equal to 0. So p is equal to 0 is already solved. We're done there. For the second one, I just have to add 4 to both sides. So p is equal to 4. All right, for f, it doesn't factor. So to factor it, we would move everything to one side, subtract x squared and subtract 14. We get x squared minus 3x minus 21. And this doesn't factor. So we would factor, but this does not factor. Because what's 2 minus 1? Just 1. Everything on the quiz will factor, so don't worry about this one. Okay, let's take a look at the first part. So question 1 says perform the operation, leave your answer in standard form. So how would I add these? Add the real parts together, so I add the like terms. 9 plus 11 would be 20. Then add the two imaginary parts together. So 5i plus 2i is what? 7i. And don't forget, the real number has to come first when it's in standard form. All right, for B, what do I have to do first here? Distribute the negative, so it only gets distributed to everything in the parentheses that it's touching. So this would be 16 minus 2 plus 3i minus I. And then what do I do next? Combine the real parts together, so this would be 14. Then combine the imaginary parts together, so 3i minus I would be 2i. All right, for C, how do I multiply these together? Three times 4, which is 12, and then what's I times I? I squared. What do we have to do whenever we see an I squared? Make it negative 1. So what is 12 times negative 1? Negative 12. Perfect. All right, I think that was supposed to be E. This one's C. So here I don't have a sign in the middle, so what does that tell me I have to do? I'm multiplying, so I have to FOIL. So notice the difference between A and C. A has a plus sign in the middle. So that means I have to add. C, there's no sign, so I have to multiply, which means I have to FOIL. So I multiply the first ones. What's 7 times 8? 56. The outsides, 7 times negative 6i, negative 42i. The insides, 40i. And then the last ones, negative 30i squared. Perfect. Whenever you have an I times an I, that would be I squared. What do I have to do anytime I see an I squared? Make it negative 1, which changes negative 30 to what? Plus 30. And then what do I do next? Combine the real parts together, so this would be 86. and then combine the imaginary parts together, so negative 2i. So 86 minus 2i. And don't forget for these two, the real part has to come first. Any questions? What do I have to do for D? Foil. So again here I'm multiplying, so that means I have to foil. Start by multiplying the first, we get 81. The outsides would be negative 45i. The insides would be plus 45i. And then the last would be negative 25i squared. So anytime I have an I squared, what do I do? Make it negative 1. And what does that change negative 25 to? A plus 25. What would I do next? Combine the real parts together and then the imaginary parts together. So 81 plus 25 is 106. What is negative 45i plus 45i? They cancel. So it's not, I mean, technically it's 0i, but 0 times I is still 0. So we wouldn't put it. Don't just put an I, because that would be like 1i. This is not 1i. They just cancel out. It's 0. They go away. So our answer is just 106 here. All right, let's look at F. How do I multiply these together? Distribute the 4i. So 4 times negative 6 is negative 24i. And 4i times 2i? 8i squared. What do I have to do next? Change the I squared to negative 1. And what is negative 1 times 8? That would make this a negative 8. What do I have to do next? Switch them. I need to put it in standard form. So the real number comes first, which now negative 8 is a real number because we got rid of the I. So negative 8 minus 24i. That's my answer. There. And then for the last two, to find the value of x and y that satisfy the equation, we just want to set our real parts equal to each other and then the imaginary parts equal to each other. So here we have 3x is equal to 27. How would I solve for x? Divide by 3, so what does x equal? 9. And then to find my y, I set the imaginary parts equal to each other, so 6i is equal to yi. Divide by I, because we want that y all by itself, so they'll cancel. So what does y equal? 6. Awesome. Any questions here? All right, for B, what do I need to do first? Set the real parts equal to each other, so 9x is equal to negative 36. How would I solve for x? Divide by 9. So what does x equal? Negative 4. How would I find y? Set the imaginary parts equal to each other. Divide by I. So the i's cancel. What else can I divide by? 6. So that way the 6 cancels too. And what is negative 18 divided by 6? Negative 3. So negative 3 is equal to y. So there's our two answers for that one.